You have said the words more times than you can count. God is first in my life. You have prayed it, declared it, written it in your journal, and meant every single word when you said it. But somewhere between the declaration and the daily reality, something is not lining up the way you expected it to. Because if God is truly first, why does your mind still race with anxiety at 2 in the morning? If God is truly first, why do your decisions still feel rushed, confused, and driven by fear instead of peace? If God is truly first, why does your life still feel like it is being pulled in 12 different directions at the same time? And here is the question that nobody in church is asking out loud, but almost everyone is privately wondering. What does putting God first actually look like when real life is happening? When the pressure is real and the stakes are high? Not in theory, not in a Sunday morning sermon, but in the Monday morning moments when everything is demanding your attention at once. Because there is a significant difference between believing God is first and actually living as though He is. And that difference shows up in very specific, very practical, very measurable ways in your daily life. Today on Bible Unmasked, we are going to pull back the curtain on exactly what that difference looks like. We are going to walk through 7 real, tangible, life-altering shifts that happen when God actually becomes first. Not when you say He is first, not when you feel like He is first, but when He genuinely, functionally, practically becomes first. And I want to be honest with you from the very beginning of this conversation. Some of what I am going to share today will challenge the version of faith you have been living with for a long time. Because real transformation is almost never what we imagined it would be before it started happening to us. So stay with me through every single shift, because the one that changes everything for you might be the last one you hear. Before we get into the 7 shifts, I need to establish something foundational that makes everything else make sense. Most people in the American church have been taught that putting God first is primarily about church attendance, Bible reading, and prayer habits. And while those practices matter deeply, they are the expressions of a first-place God, not the definition of one. Putting God first is actually a restructuring of your entire internal operating system, the way you think, decide, value, and respond. It is the difference between a life that is decorated with God and a life that is directed by God. A life decorated with God looks spiritual on the surface, but still runs on the same engine as everyone else. A life directed by God looks different from the inside out, and the difference becomes undeniable to everyone who knows you over time. Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. Is the anchor scripture for everything we are going to discuss today. Jesus said, "Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." That word seek in the original Greek is the word zeteo, which means to crave, to pursue, to keep searching for continuously. It is not a one-time act of surrender. It is a daily, moment-by-moment orientation of your entire life toward one source. And when that orientation becomes genuine and consistent, 7 very specific things begin to shift in ways you did not predict or plan. Shift number 1. Your internal chaos begins to organize itself into clarity. There is a particular kind of mental exhaustion that is almost impossible to explain to someone who has not experienced it personally. It is not the tiredness that comes from working hard or staying up late or pushing through a difficult project. It is the exhaustion of a mind that has too many things competing for the top position of importance at the exact same time. Your career is demanding your best thinking and your most creative energy every single day. Your relationships need your presence, your patience, your attention, and your emotional availability consistently. Your finances need a strategy, a plan, a level of discipline that requires mental bandwidth you often do not have left to give. Your health, your personal growth, your family obligations, your social responsibilities, all of it is screaming for first place simultaneously. And when everything is first, the brutal reality is that nothing is actually first, and nothing gets what it truly needs from you. This is the state most American adults are living in right now, believer and non-believer alike, and it is slowly draining them empty. But here is what begins to happen when God actually, functionally, moves into first place in your internal world. The competing voices do not all disappear immediately, but a hierarchy begins to form that did not exist before. You begin to develop a filter, an internal question that you run every decision and every demand through before you respond to it. That question is simple, but it is devastatingly clarifying. Does this align with what God has actually called me to right now? And when that question becomes your consistent filter, something remarkable starts happening to your daily experience of life. Things that used to feel equally urgent suddenly reveal themselves as having very different levels of actual importance. The obligation that felt life or death last week looks completely different when run through the filter of kingdom priority. The opportunity that felt like you could not afford to miss it looks different when you ask whether it aligns with your God-given assignment. The relationship that was consuming enormous amounts of your emotional energy looks different when you ask whether it is building or depleting the person God is making you. Proverbs chapter 3 verses 5 and 6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight." That word straight in the Hebrew is yashar, which means to be made even, to be made right, to have what was crooked brought into proper alignment. God does not promise to remove every path from your life. He promises to straighten the one you are supposed to be on. And clarity is what happens when the crooked becomes straight, when the overwhelming becomes organized by a wisdom greater than your own. So if your life has felt chaotic, scattered, and impossible to prioritize, it is not because you lack intelligence or discipline. It is because no human mind was designed to carry the weight of being its own ultimate authority over everything simultaneously. You were designed to have a center, and when God actually becomes that center, everything else finds its proper orbit around him. The practical shift looks like this. You stop starting your day by checking what the world needs from you first. You start your day by orienting yourself toward what God has already said about who you are and where you are going. Even 15 intentional minutes in the morning spent in that orientation will change the entire atmosphere of every hour that follows. Not because you said a magic prayer, but because you reminded your mind of what is actually first before the noise had a chance to take over. Clarity is not a personality trait. It is not a gift that only organized people receive. It is the natural result of a properly ordered life. And the proper order always begins with God at the center, everything else finding its place in relationship to that center. Shift. Number 2. Anxiety loses the authority it has been operating with in your life. Anxiety is one of the most discussed and least understood experiences in the modern American Christian community. We talk about it, we pray against it, we read books about it, and yet for millions of believers, it simply does not go away. And I want to offer you a perspective on anxiety today that most conversations about it never actually reach. Anxiety, at its theological root, is not primarily a mental health issue, it is a sovereignty issue. It is what happens in the human heart when the weight of controlling outcomes exceeds the capacity of the one trying to control them. When you are functionally your own highest authority, when the buck truly stops with you and you alone, anxiety is the completely logical response. Because you are a finite human being trying to manage an infinite number of variables in an unpredictable world with limited information. Of course, that produces anxiety. It would produce anxiety in the most mentally strong and emotionally healthy person alive. The problem is not your weakness. The problem is the assignment you have unconsciously accepted as yours to carry alone. Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7 gives us what is perhaps the most direct instruction about anxiety in the entire New Testament. Paul writes, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Most people read that passage and hear a command, "Stop being anxious. You should not feel this way. Just pray and it will go away." But what Paul is actually describing is a transfer of authority, a deliberate, conscious, repeated act of moving something from your hands into God's hands. The word supplication in the Greek is desis, which means a specific, detailed, earnest request made to someone with the power to actually do something about it. It is not vague spiritual surrender. It is precise and specific placement of a specific burden into the specific hands of a specific God. And with thanksgiving is the key that unlocks the transfer, because thanksgiving is the declaration that you trust the one receiving the burden before you see the outcome. When God actually becomes first, this transfer stops being a desperate emergency measure and becomes a daily, normal, rhythmic practice. You stop waiting until the anxiety has become unbearable. Before you bring something to God, you bring it before it has a chance to build. You stop treating prayer as the last resort when all other options have failed you. Treat it as the first response before the options even present themselves. And over time, something significant changes in the relationship between your mind and the circumstances of your life. The circumstances do not necessarily change, the bills are still real, the diagnosis is still on the paper, the relationship is still complicated. But the authority those circumstances have over your internal state begins to diminish as the authority of God's presence increases. This is not positive thinking. This is not emotional suppression. This is not pretending the hard things are not hard. This is a genuine spirit-level shift in who you have appointed as the governing authority over the outcomes of your life. And when God actually holds that authority not just in your theology, but in your daily functional experience, anxiety loses its primary fuel source. It cannot sustain itself at the same level when it no longer has the job of managing everything that you were never meant to manage alone. I want to be honest with you here, because false comfort does more damage than no comfort at all in the long run. This shift does not happen in a single prayer. It does not happen after one good Sunday morning. It does not happen because you decided it should. It happens through repeated, consistent, daily practice of actually bringing your burdens to God before your own mind has a chance to take them back. It happens through building a history with God, a record of moments where you released something and watched Him handle it better than you could have. And every time that history grows by one more entry, the anxiety has a little less ground to stand on in your life. Because you are no longer working from theory, you are working from evidence, and evidence is what faith becomes when it has been tested and found true. Shift number 3. Your decisions begin carrying a wisdom that your own mind could not produce alone. Think about the last decision you made that you genuinely regret, and be honest with yourself about how it happened. Not the surface-level story you tell other people, but the real internal sequence of events that led to that choice. Chances are it followed one of 3 very familiar patterns that almost every person in this room has lived through personally. The first pattern is the emotional decision, the one you made because it felt right in the moment and feelings were louder than wisdom. The second pattern is the pressured decision, the one you made because someone else's timeline or expectation overrode your own better judgment. The third pattern is the fear-based decision, the one you made not because it was the right move, but because you were terrified of what would happen if you waited. And the painful truth about all 3 of those patterns is that none of them are actually making decisions from a place of genuine wisdom. They are all reactions, dressed up in the clothing of choices, being made by a version of you that is not operating from your highest and most grounded self. James chapter 1 verse 5 says something that should completely reframe how every believer approaches the act of making decisions. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. That phrase, without reproach, is extraordinarily important, and it is almost always skipped over in casual readings of this passage. It means God does not give wisdom begrudgingly. He does not sigh before answering. He does not remind you of how many times you have already asked. He gives it generously, freely, without attaching shame to the asking, because He genuinely wants you to walk in wisdom more than you want it for yourself. But here is the condition that the very next verse immediately establishes, and it is the condition that changes everything about how wisdom actually arrives. Verse 6 says, "You must ask in faith, without doubting, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind." In other words, you cannot ask God for wisdom while simultaneously keeping your own conclusions already made in the back pocket of your mind. Real wisdom from God requires what is perhaps the most difficult thing a confident, capable, experienced adult can do. It requires approaching a decision with genuinely open hands, genuinely willing to receive an answer that contradicts what you already want to do. And that level of surrender is only possible when God is actually first, when His wisdom genuinely outranks your own preferences in your personal hierarchy. When God is decorative in your life, you bring decisions to Him after you have already made them, looking for confirmation of what you chose. When God is directional in your life, you bring decisions to Him before conclusions have formed, genuinely asking Him to lead rather than agree. The practical difference between those two postures produces completely different outcomes over the span of a life. The person who asks God to confirm their already made decisions will walk a path shaped primarily by their own wisdom with occasional divine input. The person who asks God to direct their unmade decisions will walk a path that consistently exceeds what their own intelligence and experience could have constructed. Proverbs chapter 16 verse 9 says, "The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." That verse is not a discouragement from planning, it is an invitation to hold your plans loosely enough that God can redirect them without resistance. Because the plans you make from your own limited vantage point are always going to be smaller than the paths God can see from His unlimited one. Here is what this shift looks like in the practical, daily, ordinary moments of a real American life in the 21st century. It looks like pausing before responding to the email that triggered you, long enough to ask what God's wisdom says about how to handle this person. It looks like sleeping on the financial decision that feels urgent, long enough to bring it genuinely before God in the morning before committing. It looks like asking the question, "Is this mine to carry?" before automatically saying yes to every opportunity or obligation that presents itself. It looks like building a habit of consultation before commitment in every area of life, not just the big, obvious ones. Because wisdom is not reserved for the major crossroads moments of career changes and marriage decisions and geographic moves. Wisdom is a daily, moment-by-moment way of moving through the world that accumulates into a life that looks remarkably different from one built on reaction alone. And the people around you will notice the shift before you fully understand what is causing it. They will notice that you seem less reactive, less impulsive, less likely to make decisions you come back from regretting 3 weeks later. They will notice that your choices seem to carry a quality of rightness that is difficult to explain purely in terms of intelligence or experience. What they are actually observing is the evidence of a life being genuinely directed by a wisdom that is not entirely your own. That is not mysticism, that is not luck, that is not a personality type that some people have and others do not. That is what happens when the wisest being in existence actually has first access to your decisions before your own fears and desires do. And over time, that access produces a track record of choices that slowly but undeniably shapes a life of uncommon direction and purpose. Shift number 4. Your relationships begin revealing their true nature and their true purpose in your life. There is nothing quite as disorienting as watching a relationship you thought was permanent begin to quietly change when your life starts to change. You did not do anything dramatic. You did not issue an ultimatum. You did not announce that you were becoming a different person. You simply started growing in a direction that some of the people around you were not prepared to grow alongside you toward. And the relationships that could not accommodate that growth began to reveal something about their foundation that proximity had been hiding. This is one of the most practically uncomfortable shifts that happens when God actually becomes first. And it is also one of the most important ones. Because the relationships in your life are not neutral. They are either moving you toward the person God is building you into or away from that person. And a life where God is genuinely first will inevitably surface that reality in ways that a life where God is decorative never fully does. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 33 says it with a directness that leaves very little room for comfortable ambiguity. Do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good character. That is not a suggestion. That is not a gentle nudge toward being more selective about your social calendar. That is a declaration that the people you consistently surround yourself with are actively shaping the person you are becoming, whether you are conscious of it or not. And when God becomes first, your spiritual sensitivity to this reality increases in ways that can initially feel uncomfortable and even disloyal. You begin to feel the drain of relationships that are built primarily on old versions of who you used to be. You begin to notice when conversations consistently pull you back toward mindsets and behaviors that no longer align with where God is taking you. You begin to recognize the difference between relationships that challenge you to grow and relationships that subtly pressure you to shrink back into familiar smallness. And the recognition itself, before you have even done anything about it, creates a kind of internal tension that demands resolution. Here is the thing that needs to be said carefully and honestly about this particular shift, because it is often mishandled in faith communities. Putting God first does not give you permission to become relationally arrogant, to write people off quickly, or to exit every difficult relationship in the name of spiritual growth. God is not calling you to build a circle of only perfect people, because those do not exist and you are not one of them. He is calling you to be discerning about which relationships have genuine capacity for mutual growth and which ones are built on a foundation that cannot hold what He is building in you. The relationship that is built on genuine love, genuine respect, and genuine commitment to each other's growth can survive and even thrive through your transformation. The relationship that is built primarily on shared compromise, shared smallness, or the mutual agreement to never challenge each other is more fragile than it appears. And when you start growing, the fragility of that second kind of relationship becomes visible in ways that proximity and familiarity had been concealing. Now, I want to speak directly to someone who is watching this and feeling the weight of a specific relationship that comes to mind when I say these things. You know who it is. You have known for longer than you have been willing to admit, and the knowing has been sitting uncomfortably in your spirit for a while. This is not a message giving you permission to be careless with someone's heart or dismissive of a relationship that has real history and real love in it. This is an invitation to bring that relationship honestly before God, to ask Him what His wisdom says about it, and to trust what He shows you, because God is not in the business of making you lonely. He is in the business of making you surrounded by the right people for the right reasons. And sometimes the right people are the same ones who have always been in your life, just encountered in a new and deeper way after both of you have grown. But sometimes the right people are the ones you have not met yet, the ones who are waiting in the season that your obedience is walking you toward. Here is the other side of this shift that is equally important and far less discussed in conversations about spiritual growth and relationships. When God actually becomes first, the way you love the people who stay in your life changes in ways that are genuinely beautiful and genuinely costly. You become more patient, not because patience is your natural temperament, but because you have been receiving patience from a God who has every reason to give up on you. You become more forgiving, not because the offense no longer matters, but because you have been forgiven things far larger than anything anyone has done to you. You become more present, not because your schedule cleared up, but because you understand that the people in front of you are image bearers of a God you have placed first. Romans chapter 12 verse 10 says, "Love one another with brotherly affection, outdo one another in showing honor." That phrase, outdo one another in showing honor, describes a posture toward people that is only sustainable when it is being fed from a source greater than yourself. Because human love, running on human fuel, has limits that show up clearly under pressure and in seasons of inconvenience. But love that flows from a genuine, daily, first-place connection to the God who is love himself operates from a reservoir that does not run dry the same way. And the people in your life will feel the difference. They will feel cared for in a way that they cannot quite articulate but cannot deny. Not because you became perfect, but because the source you are drawing from became primary in a way it was not before. This shift in your relationships is one of the most visible and most verifiable signs that something genuine has happened in your internal world. Because you can fake church attendance, you can fake Bible reading habits, you can fake spiritual disciplines in spaces where people are looking. But you cannot fake the quality of love that flows from a heart that has genuinely placed God above every other source of identity, security, and significance. The people closest to you will know the difference long before anyone else does, and their experience of you will be the truest testimony of whether the shift is real. Shift number 5. Your identity stops being something you perform and starts being something you carry. There is a kind of exhaustion that is completely invisible to everyone around you because it does not show up in your physical body or your external circumstances. It is the exhaustion of constantly managing how you are perceived, constantly adjusting who you present yourself as depending on who is in the room. It is the exhaustion of building your sense of worth on foundations that shift without warning and require constant maintenance to keep stable. Your performance at work tells you whether you are valuable this week, and when the performance dips, the value feels like it dips with it. The approval of the people around you tells you whether you are acceptable, and when the approval disappears, the acceptability feels like it disappears too. Your social standing, your appearance, your accomplishments, your reputation. All of it functioning as a fragile and temporary answer to a permanent and fundamental question. The question that every human being is asking beneath every other question they will ever ask in their lifetime. Am I enough? Do I matter? Is there something about me that is worth something beyond what I can produce or perform or present? And the tragedy is that most people spend their entire lives trying to answer that question from sources that were never designed to carry the weight of it. Because every external source of identity has a ceiling, and the ceiling is always lower than what the human soul actually requires to feel genuinely whole. But here is what begins to happen when God actually, functionally, practically becomes first in the way you understand who you are. The question does not disappear, but it finds an answer that does not shift with circumstances, with seasons, with other people's opinions, or with your own performance. Psalm chapter 139 verses 13 and 14 says something that should permanently alter every believer's relationship with their own identity. For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. That word fearfully in the Hebrew is yare, which means with reverence, with awe, with a holy seriousness that reflects the weight of what was being created. God did not casually produce you as an afterthought in the mass manufacturing of human beings across history. He formed you with the kind of deliberate, reverent, intentional attention that a master craftsman gives to the work that will bear his signature. And the identity that comes from being made by that kind of maker, with that kind of intentionality, is not subject to revision based on how your Tuesday went. It is not contingent on whether your boss acknowledged your work, or whether your family understood your choices, or whether your social media post performed well. It is not suspended during the seasons where your failures are more visible than your victories, or where your struggles are more prominent than your strengths. It is fixed. It is permanent. It is written into the nature of who you are at a level that no external circumstance has the authority to overwrite. But here is the critical distinction that separates theological knowledge of this truth from the lived, practical, daily experience of it. Knowing that your identity is secure in God is completely different from actually drawing your identity from God in the moment when something threatens it. You can know the verse, quote the verse, teach the verse, and still reach for external validation the moment someone questions your worth. You can believe the theology and still feel completely undone when the performance review is negative, or the relationship ends, or the plan falls apart. The shift happens not when you learn the truth about your identity, but when God becomes first enough in your daily experience that the truth becomes your first response instead of your recovery position. When something threatens your sense of worth, the question becomes, where does your mind go first in that moment of threat? Does it go to God, to what He has already said, to the fixed and permanent reality of who you are in Him before the threat ever arrived? Or does it go to the threat itself, to the opinion of the person, to the performance metric, to the comparison with someone who seems to have what you are missing? The direction your mind travels first in those moments is the truest indication of what is actually first in your life in practice. And when God is genuinely first, the travel time between threat and truth begins to shorten in ways that change the entire experience of your daily life. You still feel the sting of criticism, you still notice the pain of rejection, you still experience the disappointment of failure. But those experiences no longer have the authority to redefine you, because the definition was settled somewhere they cannot reach. Ephesians chapter 2 verse 10 says, "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." That word handiwork in the Greek is poiema, which is the root of our English word poem, meaning a carefully crafted work of creative expression. You are not a mistake. You are not an accident. You are not a rough draft that God never got around to finishing properly. You are a poem, written by the most intentional author in existence, carrying a meaning that was placed inside you before you had any say in the matter. And when that becomes the primary lens through which you see yourself, the exhausting performance of identity management begins to lose its grip on your daily energy. You stop needing to convince people of your worth because you are no longer primarily deriving your worth from their conclusions about you. You stop shrinking in rooms where you feel outmatched because your value was never determined by the competition in the room. You stop overextending yourself to earn approval because the approval that matters most has already been permanently and irrevocably extended to you. This does not make you arrogant, it makes you free. And free people change rooms without even trying to, because freedom is one of the most magnetic things a human being can carry. The shift in your identity is not a destination you arrive at once and then live from effortlessly for the rest of your life. It is a daily returning to the source, a daily reorienting toward the truth, a daily choice to draw from the well that does not run dry instead of the ones that do. But every time you make that choice, the identity built on God becomes a little more stable and a little more primary than the one built on performance. And over months and years of that daily returning, you become someone who carries themselves differently, not because life got easier, but because the foundation got deeper. Shift number 6, discipline. Stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like partnership. Ask most people what they think of when they hear the word discipline, and the associations that come up are almost universally negative. Restriction, deprivation, grinding effort, white-knuckling your way through things you do not want to do in pursuit of results you are not sure will come. And if that is the framework through which you have been approaching spiritual discipline and personal growth, no wonder it has felt unsustainable. Because discipline built on willpower alone has a biological ceiling, and that ceiling is lower than almost every meaningful goal you will ever set for yourself. Neuroscience has now confirmed what Scripture established thousands of years ago. The human will is a finite resource that depletes with use throughout the day, which means the discipline strategy of simply trying harder, wanting it more, and grinding through the resistance is working against the actual architecture of how you were made. But here is what changes when God actually becomes first in the way you approach growth, change, and the daily choices that shape your life over time. Discipline stops being something you do to yourself and starts being something you do with God. And that shift changes everything about how it feels and how long it lasts. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 13 says, "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man." A God is faithful, and He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation He will also provide the way of escape. Notice the structure of that promise. It is not, God will remove every temptation from your path, so discipline becomes unnecessary. It is, God will be present in every moment of temptation and will provide a way through it that your willpower alone could not find. The discipline of the person who has placed God first is not the white-knuckled discipline of someone fighting alone against their own nature. It is the co-laboring discipline of someone who has a partner in the process, someone whose strength supplements the places where their own strength runs short. Philippians chapter 4 verse 13 is one of the most quoted verses in the Christian world and also one of the most misapplied. "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me" is not a promise that you will win every competition or succeed at every endeavor. In context, Paul is talking about contentment in every circumstance, about the ability to be stable, whether in abundance or in need. He is describing the discipline of a settled spirit in an unsettled world, and he is attributing that discipline entirely to the strength that comes from his connection to Christ. The practical application for your daily life looks like this shift in the question you ask at the beginning of every morning. Instead of asking, "How much willpower do I have today, and how far can I make it last?" you ask, "What has God already made available to me for today?" Instead of treating discipline as a performance you have to sustain through personal determination, you treat it as a response to a grace that is already present and already active. And over time, that shift in posture produces a consistency that pure willpower-based discipline simply cannot maintain across the inevitable difficult seasons of life. Because willpower-based discipline depends entirely on your internal conditions being favorable enough to sustain the effort. Grace-based discipline operates from a source that does not fluctuate with your mood, your energy level, your circumstances, or your current season of struggle. Here is what this looks like in the real, practical, unsexy daily experience of actually building a disciplined life. It looks like returning to your morning routine on the day after you completely failed to keep it, without spending 3 days in self-condemnation first. It looks like recommitting to the habit you broke last week without treating the break as evidence that you are fundamentally incapable of change. It looks like approaching your areas of consistent struggle, not with shame about why you keep returning to them, but with honest, open conversation with God about what is underneath them. Because discipline that is disconnected from understanding why you keep choosing what you keep choosing is just behavior management without transformation. And God is not interested in managing your behavior. He is interested in transforming the heart that is producing the behavior. Ezekiel chapter 36 verse 26 says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. That is not a verse about trying harder. That is a verse about receiving something you could not produce through effort alone. The discipline that flows from a transformed heart is qualitatively different from the discipline that flows from a determined will. It is sustainable in a different way. It is motivated in a different way. It is connected to purpose in a way that raw, willpower-based discipline rarely achieves. And when God is genuinely first, the transformation of the heart is not something you are waiting for as a future event. It is something you are participating in daily through every choice you make to orient yourself toward Him before you orient yourself toward anything else. The accumulation of those daily orientations over months and years produces a person whose discipline looks effortless from the outside. Not because it is effortless, but because it is drawing from a source deep enough to sustain what surface-level effort never could. Shift number 7. Your perspective on everything that happens to you fundamentally and permanently changes. This 7th shift is the one that ties every other shift together, because it is the lens through which all of the others are seen and sustained. And it is also the shift that is the most difficult to describe in practical terms, because it operates at a level that is deeper than behavior or habit or decision-making. It operates at the level of meaning, at the level of interpretation, at the level of the story you are telling yourself about what your life actually is and what it is for. Before God is genuinely first, most people are operating from a story about their life that is centered on themselves as both the main character and the ultimate author. In that story, good things happening means life is going well and God is pleased, and hard things happening means something has gone wrong that needs to be fixed immediately. Pain is a problem, delay is a failure, loss is a tragedy without redemption, and the goal is to minimize suffering and maximize comfort as efficiently as possible. And that story, while completely understandable, produces a relationship with difficulty that is fundamentally adversarial and ultimately exhausting. Because life in a broken world guarantees that hard things will happen, and a story that has no framework for hard things producing anything meaningful will eventually collapse under the weight of reality. But here is what begins to happen to the story you are telling about your own life when God actually, genuinely, functionally becomes first in your interpretive framework. Romans chapter 8 verse 28 becomes not just a verse you recite when things go wrong, but a lived, experiential, evidenced reality that you have seen operate in your own story. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. That word works in the Greek is synerge, which is the root of our English word synergy, meaning to work together, to cooperate toward a unified outcome. God is not passively watching your life and occasionally stepping in to fix the parts that break. He is actively, continuously, synergistically working every element toward a purpose. Every element, the painful ones, the confusing ones, the ones that made no sense when they happened and still make limited sense in hindsight. All of them are inside the working. All of them are inside the purpose. All of them are being woven into something that your limited vantage point cannot yet fully see. And when that becomes the lens through which you interpret your experience, the question you ask about hard things changes at a fundamental level. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" as though the question is an accusation and difficulty is evidence of divine abandonment. You start asking, "What is God doing through this?" as though the question is an invitation and difficulty is evidence of divine activity in your story. That single shift in question changes your entire relationship with the hard seasons of your life in ways that are both practical and profound. It changes how long you stay in grief, not because you suppress the grief, but because grief carried with purpose moves differently than grief carried without it. It changes how you respond to failure, not because failure stops hurting, but because failure interpreted as formation produces something that failure interpreted as condemnation never can. It changes how you wait in the seasons of delay, not because waiting becomes easy, but because waiting with expectation is a completely different experience than waiting with dread. James chapter 1 verses 2 through 4 says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance, and perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." The phrase, "consider it pure joy," is not an instruction to pretend difficulty feels good or to perform happiness you do not feel. The word consider in the Greek is hegeomai, which means to lead your thinking, to deliberately direct your mind toward a conclusion it would not reach on its own. It is an act of interpretive will, a choice to see through the difficulty to what the difficulty is producing, even when the production is not yet visible. And that act of interpretive will is only consistently possible when the one doing the interpreting has genuinely placed the author of the story in first place. Because if you are the author of your own story, difficulty is a plot problem that needs to be resolved as quickly as possible. But if God is the author of your story, difficulty is a plot device in the hands of someone who has already written the ending and knows exactly how every chapter contributes to it. This perspective shift does not remove the pain from your hard seasons. It gives the pain a dignity that transforms how you carry it. It does not make loss smaller. It makes the meaning of the loss larger than the loss itself, which is the only thing that ever makes loss truly bearable. And over time, as you accumulate experiences of seeing God work through things you thought were only working against you, the perspective becomes less of a choice and more of a default. You begin to approach new difficulties with a kind of settled expectation, a deep and quiet knowing that this too is inside the working, this too is inside the purpose. That is not denial, that is not spiritual bypass, that is not the toxic positivity of pretending everything is fine when it is clearly not. That is the hard-won, evidence-based, scripture-grounded confidence of someone who has walked with a faithful God long enough to know that faithful is what He always, without exception, turns out to be. We have walked through 7 shifts today, and before we close, I want to bring them all together so the full picture lands clearly. Shift 1. Your internal chaos begins organizing itself into clarity because a properly ordered life always starts with a properly placed center. Shift 2. Anxiety loses the authority it has been operating with because the weight you were never designed to carry has been transferred to the one designed to hold it. Shift 3. Your decisions begin carrying a wisdom your own mind could not produce because you stopped asking God to confirm your choices and started asking Him to direct them. Shift 4. Your relationships begin revealing their true nature because growth always surfaces what proximity had been hiding about the foundations beneath you. Shift 5. Your identity stops being something you perform and starts being something you carry because the source you are drawing from became permanent instead of provisional. Shift 6. Discipline stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like partnership because you stopped trying to sustain change alone and started co-laboring with grace. Shift 7. Your perspective on everything that happens to you fundamentally changes because you stopped being the author of your own story and gave the pen back to the one who wrote it first. 7 shifts, all of them connected, all of them flowing from one single, deceptively simple, profoundly costly decision. The decision to actually, genuinely, functionally place God first, not in your words, not in your theology, but in the daily, practical, moment-by-moment operation of your real life. I want to be honest with you about something before this video ends, because you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort. This is not a decision you make once on a Sunday morning and then coast on for the rest of your spiritual life. This is a decision you make every morning before the noise starts, every afternoon when the pressure builds, every evening when the exhaustion tempts you toward old patterns. It is a decision you make when the anxiety rises and your first instinct is to take the burden back from the hands you just placed it in. It is a decision you make when the relationship is hard and the easier path is to respond from your wound instead of from your wisdom. It is a decision you make when the delay stretches longer than your patience and the temptation to take control grows louder than the peace of trusting the process. It is a decision made in the small moments more than the large ones, because the small moments are where the actual architecture of a life is built or neglected. And I want to tell you something about those small moments that I think will reframe how you approach the decision going forward. God is not grading your consistency. He is not keeping a record of the mornings you failed to put Him first before you checked your phone. He is not tallying the decisions you made from fear instead of faith, or the relationships you handled from your wound instead of your wisdom. He is the God who ran toward the prodigal son while the son was still a long way off, before the apology was complete and before the behavior had changed. He is the God who met Peter on the shore after the denial, not with condemnation, but with breakfast and a question that restored what shame had broken. He is the God who took Paul, who had been killing Christians, and turned him into the man who wrote more of the New Testament than anyone else. The point is not that you will be perfect at putting God first. The point is that you keep returning to the decision every time you drift from it. Because the returning itself is the putting Him first, the returning is the surrender. The returning is the faith that says, I know where the center needs to be, even when I keep forgetting. And every time you return, something in you is being strengthened that was not as strong before you drifted and came back. The muscle of returning is the most important muscle in the spiritual life, and it is built only through the repeated practice of actually using it. So here is what I want to leave you with as you close this video and walk back into the reality of your actual daily life. The 7 shifts we discussed today are not a checklist to accomplish. They are a description of a life in process, moving in a direction that matters. You may be in the early stages of shift 1 and not yet anywhere near shift 7, and that is exactly where you are supposed to be. You may have experienced glimpses of several shifts and then felt them slip away in a hard season. And that is part of the journey, not evidence of failure. You may be watching this and realizing that God has been first in your words for years, but not yet first in the actual functional operation of your daily life. And if that is you, this is not a moment for shame. This is a moment for honesty, because honesty with yourself is the beginning of every real shift. The question is not whether you have been perfect. The question is whether today, right now, in this moment, you are willing to make the decision again. Not the dramatic, emotional, altar call version of the decision, but the quiet, honest, eyes-open version that says, I want my life to actually be directed by you, not just decorated by you. I want the clarity, I want the peace, I want the wisdom, I want the relationships, I want the identity, I want the discipline, I want the perspective. And I understand now that all of it flows from one source, and that source needs to be first in a way it has not yet been allowed to be first. If that is the decision you are making today, I want you to do something very specific in the comment section below this video. Type the words, God, direct me, as a declaration that you are moving from decoration to direction, from performance to surrender, from your own authorship to His. Not as a magic formula, not as a transaction, but as a genuine and honest statement of where you want your life to actually be oriented going forward. Because declarations made publicly carry a weight that private decisions sometimes do not, and the community watching this video needs to know they are not alone in making it. Matthew chapter 6 verse 33 says it better than anything else that could be said to close this conversation. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. All these things, the clarity, the peace, the wisdom, the right relationships, the stable identity, the sustainable discipline, the transformed perspective. All of it is downstream from one upstream decision that gets made and remade every single day of a life lived in genuine pursuit of a first-place God. You are not behind. You are not too late. You have not drifted too far from the center for the returning to mean something real and something lasting. The God who is first is also the God who is near, and near means closer than the anxiety that is telling you the distance is too great to cross. Near means present in the decision you are making right now, in this moment, before this video ends and the noise of life starts again. Near means already working in the shift you have not yet seen, already weaving the thread you cannot yet trace, already writing the chapter you have not yet lived. Put Him first today, not perfectly, not completely, not with full understanding of everything that will change when you do. Put Him first simply, honestly, one morning at a time, one decision at a time, one returning at a time. And watch what 7 shifts can do to a life that was built for exactly this kind of reorientation toward the one who made it. Subscribe to Bible Unmasked for more messages that go beyond the surface of faith and into the places where real transformation actually lives. Because this channel exists for one reason, to unmask the truths that keep people stuck at the level of belief when God designed them to live at the level of transformation. Share this video with one person whose life you believe is one shift away from looking completely different than it does right now. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone you love is put the right word in front of them at exactly the right moment. And this might be that moment for someone in your life who needs it more than either of you currently knows.